Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
Yeah, and I'm really looking forward to getting into this one.
Me too. So I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you are building a fortified bunker.
Okay. Like total doomsday prep situation.
Exactly. You spend years reinforcing the walls with, reinforced steel. You stockpile a year's worth of provisions, install state-of-the-art security systems, and you basically prepare for every conceivable external threat.
Right. You're ready for anything.
Right. And then, after surviving the greatest Category 5 hurricane in history, the doors are secure, the walls hold, the threat passes.
You've made it.
You've made it. You breathe a sigh of relief, you walk over to your meticulously stocked pantry, you eat an apple that just happened to go bad, and you die from food poisoning.
Wow. Yeah, that is the ultimate tragic irony right there.
It really is.
You survive the catastrophic external threat, only to be taken out by a quiet internal rot. And you completely overlooked it because you were so, hyper-focused on the perimeter.
And that dynamic, that devastating realization that the most dangerous threats often come from inside the house or, even inside our own habits,
right.
That is the beating heart of our deep dive today.
It absolutely is.
We are taking a massive journey through one of the most turbulent, chaotic, and frankly, psychologically complex eras of ancient history.
Yeah, it's a wild ride.
It is. We are examining 2 Kings, chapters 18 through 25, looking at the final decades of the Kingdom of Judah. And we are drawing from the biblical text itself, but we're also weaving in the deep historical and theological analysis of Barnes' notes on the whole Bible and Matthew Henry's complete commentary.
Right, and the goal here is not just to recount ancient history. I mean, we're not doing history lecture.
No, definitely not.
The goal is to act as thoughtful guides to help you extract the practical wisdom from these texts. We're going to watch a series of kings grapple with, impossible existential crises.
Yeah, really impossible situations.
Right, and we will see them get intoxicated by the deceptive comfort of their own success.
Yeah. And
ultimately, we will watch them confront the heartbreaking collapse of their entire society.
And the reason you should care about these ancient, dust-covered monarchs is that their struggles are shockingly modern.
Oh, very much so.
They are forced to figure out where to place their trust when they are under relentless bad faith attack. They have to navigate what happens when the tools and traditions that used to save them suddenly become the very things destroying them.
Yeah, which is something we all deal with.
Exactly. These are the exact same struggles you face in your career, in your relationships, and in your own internal development today. So to really understand how a society completely unravels, we have to start by looking at its last great stand. We begin with a king named Hezekiah.
Right. And to understand Hezekiah's mindset, we really have to establish the sheer level of dysfunction he inherited.
It was bad.
It was so bad. Hezekiah comes to the throne of Judah when he's 25 years old, and the nation is an absolute mess. His father, King Ahaz, was essentially a geopolitical and spiritual disaster.
Just a complete train wreck.
Completely. Ahaz had closed the doors of the temple. He stripped its treasures to pay off foreign powers, and he even set up pagan altars on every street corner in Jerusalem. The moral and institutional decay was just profound.
So Hezekiah, whose name, by the way, translates to strength of Yahweh, he steps into this environment and immediately initiates a massive, sweeping reform.
He cleans house.
He does. He reopens the temple. He organizes the priests. He starts smashing the false altars. But there is one specific thing he destroys that is absolutely fascinating, and it stops me in my tracks every time I read it.
Oh, the Nehushtan.
Yes, he destroys a sacred relic called the Nehushtan.
Yeah, and the Nehushtan is one of the most profound psychological metaphors in this entire text. According to the historical record, this was the ancient bronze serpent crafted by Moses centuries earlier, during the wilderness wanderings. When the Israelites were being bitten by venomous snakes, God instructed Moses to make a bronze serpent and put it on a pole. Anyone who looked at it was miraculously healed.
Wow.
So it was a literal historical instrument of salvation for their ancestors.
But wait, let me push back on this a little bit. If this object was an artifact from Moses himself, like a tangible piece of their history that proved God's deliverance, isn't destroying it incredibly dangerous?
It really seems like it, yeah.
I mean, it feels like erasing your own heritage. Why is he smashing something that God explicitly commanded Moses to make?
Well, that is the exact tension Hezekiah is navigating. And it's why his action requires so much courage. Barnes' notes points out that desecrating a time-honored sanctuary or artifact like this would have been a rude shock to the feelings of the masses.
Oh, I'm sure they were furious.
They loved this thing. But over the centuries, the people had stopped looking at the god who provided the healing, and they started worshiping the bronze serpent itself. They were literally burning incense to it.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, the tool of past salvation had become a present idol.
So he grinds it to powder. He literally pulverizes it, and he calls it Nehushtan, which essentially translates to a piece of brass.
Right, just a piece of brass.
He looks at this sacred, beloved artifact, and he just demystifies it. He strips away all its unearned power and says, no, this is holding us back. It's toxic.
And that shows how Hezekiah recognized a profound psychological truth. Good things, when idolized, are better parted with than kept. He realized that a method or a tradition that brought healing in a past season can actually become a barrier to growth in the present season if you start trusting the method instead of the source.
Think about what that looks like today. You might have developed a fierce independence or like a defensive armor during a really difficult, traumatic childhood.
Yeah, a lot of people do.
And at the time, that emotional armor was your bronze serpent. It saved you. It got you through the wilderness. But now, 20 years later, you are in a marriage or you're trying to build a collaborative business, and that same fierce independence is keeping you isolated.
It's destroying your intimacy.
Exactly. What saved you then is poisoning you now.
And that requires an incredible level of self-awareness to look at your own life and say, this coping mechanism, this business strategy, this tradition is becoming a Nehushtan. It's just a piece of brass, and I need to break it to move forward.
Yeah, it's so hard to do.
It is. But Hezekiah's internal reforms, as brilliant as they are, don't happen in a vacuum.
Yeah.
Just as he is getting the internal house in order, a terrifying external reality arrives at his doorstep.
Right. The Assyrian war machine. And we really need to dwell on just how terrifying this empire was. Under the leadership of King Sennacherib, the Assyrians were the undisputed tyrannical superpower of the ancient Near East.
They're brutal.
They had already swept through the region and utterly destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel. They had captured Samaria. They deported hundreds of thousands of people, completely erasing their national identity. And now they march south and they surround Jerusalem.
Yeah, the Assyrian army was unprecedented in its efficiency, its logistics, and its calculated brutality. Barnes details their siege tactics. You know, the massive earthen ramps they would build against city walls, the battering rams, the archers hiding behind towering wicker shields.
It sounds like something out of a movie.
It really does. And their reputation preceded them. I mean, they were known for flaying captured leaders alive and stacking skulls outside conquered city gates. They used terror as a primary diplomatic tool.
Hezekiah is terrified. He actually tries to buy them off first, right?
He does, yeah.
The text says he empties the public treasuries. He even strips the gold overlay off the temple doors to put together a massive ransom. It was 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. In modern terms, we are talking about hundreds of millions of dollars.
Just completely liquidating the nation's wealth.
Exactly, all to appease Sennacherib.
And it fails completely. Sennacherib takes the money, he steps back briefly, and then he sends his army right back to finish the job. It is a harsh lesson in geopolitics and, honestly, personal boundaries. You cannot appease an empire or a toxic individual that ultimately wants to consume you. Paying the extortion simply funds their next attack.
So the Assyrians surround Jerusalem, and they send a delegation of top officials, led by a man bearing the title of the Rabshakeh, to demand absolute surrender. And the speech the Rabshakeh delivers standing outside the walls of Jerusalem is, well, it is a masterclass in psychological warfare.
It really is the anatomy of intimidation. The Rabshakeh approaches the wall, and Hezekiah's officials come out to meet him. They beg the Rabshakeh to speak in Aramaic.
Because Aramaic was the language of diplomacy, right?
Right, exactly. The language of the educated elite. They want him to use Aramaic so that the common Judean soldier sitting on the city wall won't understand the negotiations.
But the Rabshakeh actively, aggressively refuses. He wants the rank-and-file soldiers to hear every single word.
Oh, absolutely.
He shouts at the top of his lungs in Hebrew, and the things he says are designed to incite sheer panic. He bypasses the leadership entirely. He knows that to break a fortified city, you don't necessarily have to break the stone walls. You just have to break the will of the people defending them.
Yeah.
So he threatens them with the absolute visceral horrors of a prolonged siege. He tells them they will be reduced to starvation, to eating their own waste and drinking their own urine. It is graphic, it is coarse, and it is meticulously designed to bypass their logic and trigger their primal survival instincts.
It is so incredibly modern. If you strip away the ancient setting, this is the exact playbook of a hostile corporate takeover or, a sophisticated disinformation campaign.
Totally.
The attacker realizes the CEO and the board are entrenched, so they bypass leadership entirely and go straight to the employees. They leak rumors to the press. They send direct emails. They whisper at the water cooler. They say, management is lying to you. They are hiding the real numbers. The company is going bankrupt. Your pensions are evaporating, and resistance is completely futile. That parallel is spot on, because the goal is to create a crisis of trust. And notice how surgically precise the Rabshakeh's arguments are. He doesn't just hurl insults. He dismantles their security systems one by one.
Yeah, he really breaks it down.
First, he attacks their geopolitical alliances. Hezekiah had been desperately hoping for military backup from Egypt. The Rabshakeh mocks this. He calls Egypt a bruised reed and says that if you lean on it for support, it will simply snap and pierce your own hand.
And the terrifying thing is, he's actually right.
He is.
Historically, Egypt was notorious for promising support to these smaller buffer states and then failing to show up when the Assyrians actually arrived. The Rabshakeh is using factual evidence to build a narrative of despair.
And that is the hallmark of effective psychological manipulation. It always weaves in undeniable facts. But then he pivots and attacks their religious reforms. And this is the most devious part of the speech. He shouts to the people on the wall, "Aren't you trusting in the God whose altars Hezekiah just tore down?"
Oh, that is so twisted. He's taking Hezekiah's righteous reform, the destruction of the pagan high places, and the centralization of worship at the temple and framing it as an insult to God.
Yeah, Matthew Henry has a brilliant insight here. He points out that the Rabshakeh is measuring the God of Israel by the standard of the local pagan gods of the ancient world.
Right.
In the pagan mindset, a god's power and honor were measured by the sheer number of altars dedicated to them. The Assyrian official doesn't understand the theology of centralized worship in Jerusalem, so he gaslights the populace. He tells them that their king has actually offended their God by destroying all those country shrines.
He's making them second-guess their own progress, and then he deploys the ultimate weapon. He claims that he is the one operating on a divine mandate. He says, "Do you think I came up here to destroy this place without the Lord? The Lord himself told me to march against this country and destroy it.
Your God actually sent me to ruin you." I mean, imagine the psychological devastation of hearing that.
It's just brutal.
And he follows it up with a wager that is just dripping with sarcasm.
Yeah.
He offered them 2,000 horses if they could even find enough men to ride them. He is telling them that their resources are pathetic, that their military is a joke.
Yeah.
And then he points to the irrefutable evidence of history. He says, "Look around. Look at all the other nations we have conquered. Did any of their gods save them from the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? They burned. You are no different. You are next."
This voice, this Rabshakeh, is universal. Think about the last time you faced overwhelming intimidation. Maybe it's a toxic supervisor who undermines your competence in front of your peers. Maybe it's a hypercritical family member. Or, very likely, it is your own internal imposter syndrome.
Oh, absolutely. The imposter syndrome is real.
It's that voice standing outside the walls of your mind, shouting in a language you perfectly understand, telling you that your resources are a joke. It points to your past failures. It tells you that your support systems, your Egypt, are going to abandon you. It tells you that your attempts to reform your life, to go to therapy or set boundaries, have actually made things worse.
And just like the Assyrian official, imposter syndrome uses real evidence. It points to the times you did fail. It points to the people who did betray you. It uses just enough truth to make the lie feel insurmountable.
Yeah.
So the profound question for you is, what is the practical how-to when you are facing this kind of paralyzing bad faith intimidation? How do you defend against a narrative that feels so true?
We really have to look closely at Hezekiah's response because it is incredibly disciplined. First of all, before the Rabshakeh even started speaking, Hezekiah had given his people on the wall a strict command. He said, "Do not answer him. Total silence."
That is boundary setting at its finest. You cannot debate with that level of toxic bad faith manipulation. You cannot out-argue a propagandist who is committed to destroying you. Engaging with the Rabshakeh only legitimizes his presence and amplifies his chaos. Silence is the first line of defense.
But the intimidation escalates. Hezekiah soon receives a terrifying, formal letter from the Assyrian command. repeating all these claims, laying out the absolute destruction that is coming. And Hezekiah's reaction to this letter is one of the most powerful, visceral moments in the text.
He doesn't fire off an angry reply. He doesn't call an emergency meeting of his generals. He doesn't panic and surrender. He takes the physical letter, he walks into the inner courts of the temple, and he literally spreads it out before the Lord.
I have to play devil's advocate here, because to a modern listener, taking a threatening military letter and laying it on the floor of a temple feels like spiritualized denial. It feels passive.
Sure, it looks that way.
The enemy is outside the gates building siege ramps, and he's having a quiet time. How is this an effective strategy?
It looks passive from the outside, but internally, it is the most active, powerful thing he could do. Barnes notes that Hezekiah is engaging in a profound act of recontextualization. When you are in a panic state, your amygdala is hijacked. You lose the ability to see the bigger picture. By taking the letter into a quiet, sacred space, Hezekiah is forcing a neurobiological and spiritual pause.
He's breaking the cycle of reactivity.
Precisely. And look at the content of his prayer. He doesn't live in denial. He looks at the letter and says, "Yes, Lord, the Assyrian kings have laid waste to all these other nations. The data is correct." He acknowledges the brutal reality of the threat.
Right, he doesn't pretend the army isn't there.
Exactly. But then he reframes it. He says, those other nations were trusting in gods of wood and stone. They were measuring their security by the wrong metrics. He appeals to the ultimate authority, to the creator of heaven and earth. He takes the immediate terrifying crisis and places it against the backdrop of eternal truth.
That is a brilliant practice to adopt. The next time you receive a threatening email from a client or a devastating medical diagnosis or a harsh, unfair critique from a peer, do not react in the heat of the moment.
Do not hit reply.
Right. Do not hit reply. Take the letter, whether it is a literal document or a metaphorical crisis step, into a quiet space and lay it out before a higher perspective. Acknowledge the threat. Say out loud, yes, this criticism stings. Yes, the financial numbers look terrible. But then weigh that threat against your core values, your foundational truths, and your ultimate purpose.
You have to stop measuring your internal resilience by the superficial, failing metrics of the outside world. The Assyrians assumed Hezekiah was weak because he didn't have a massive cavalry and because he had dismantled all the local shrines. They measured him by the metrics of empire and volume. But Hezekiah's strength wasn't in his horses. It was in his quiet, unyielding alignment with the truth.
And because he aligns himself with that truth, he is able to seek the counsel of the prophet Isaiah. And Isaiah delivers a message that cuts through all the propaganda. He basically tells Hezekiah, do not be afraid of the words you have heard. All that Assyrian boasting, it's just noise. The king of Assyria is not going to enter the city. He's not going to shoot a single arrow here.
And the result of this alignment is one of the most stunning, miraculous reversals in ancient literature. The text tells us that that very night, an angel of the Lord goes out into the Assyrian camp and strikes down 185,000 soldiers.
Bro, the silent, invisible defense completely obliterates the loud, visible threat. When morning breaks, the terrifying war machine is nothing but a graveyard.
It's incredible.
Sennacherib, the great and terrible emperor, packs up his tent and goes home to Nineveh in absolute disgrace, where he is eventually assassinated by his own sons while worshiping in the temple of his false god. The crisis is miraculously averted. Jerusalem is saved. Hezekiah is vindicated.
It is a soaring triumph. But, this brings us to a crucial turning point in our deep dive, because what the text reveals next is deeply unsettling. It shows us that surviving a massive crisis is not the end of the story. In fact, surviving the crisis introduces an entirely new and in some ways much more insidious danger.
Yeah, we move from the crucible of war to the profound vulnerability of peacetime. Because ironically, it is not the terrifying Assyrian army that causes Hezekiah to stumble. It is the peace, the prosperity, and the intoxication of success that follow.
The context for this next failure begins with a deeply personal crisis. Right around the time of the Assyrian threat, Hezekiah falls mortally ill. The text specifies he has a severe boil, likely a symptom of a systemic, life-threatening disease.
Oh, yeah.
And prophet Isaiah, the same man who just delivered the promise of deliverance from Assyria, comes to him and delivers a devastating prognosis. He says, "Set your house in order, for you shall die. You shall not recover."
Set your house in order. What a heavy, chilling phrase. Hezekiah is still a relatively young man, likely in his late 30s at this point.
Yeah.
He has so much left to do. He turns his face to the wall, away from his attendants, and he weeps bitterly. He pleads with God, pouring out his heart, reminding God of his sincere devotion and how he walked in truth. And in a beautiful moment of divine responsiveness, God hears him. Before Isaiah has even walked out into the middle courtyard of the palace, God intercepts the prophet and sends him right back to Hezekiah with a new message. I have heard your prayer. I have seen your tears. Behold, I will heal you. I will add 15 years to your life.
And the manner of the healing is fascinating because it blends the natural with the supernatural.
Yes, it's a brilliant detail. Isaiah orders a cake of figs to be brought and applied as a poultice to the boil. Barnes notes that while figs were a known ancient remedy for skin ailments, they were naturally entirely insufficient to cure a mortal systemic illness of this magnitude.
So God utilizes a practical, natural means to deliver a supernatural result. But Hezekiah, still reeling from the death sentence, asks for a sign that he will actually recover.
And he gets a sign that defies physics. God gives him a choice regarding the shadow on the stairway, or sundial, of Ahaz. Hezekiah says, it's easy for a shadow to lengthen and go forward. Make it go backward 10 steps. And the shadow moves backward. It is a massive cosmic validation of Hezekiah's life and God's favor toward him.
So consider Hezekiah's psychological state at this moment. He has faced down the greatest military empire on earth and won. He has faced down a terminal illness and won. He has literally seen the sun move backward for him. He has been granted a miraculous 15-year extension on his life. He's wealthy, he's secure, and he is undeniably the man of the hour.
He is riding the ultimate high, and this is precisely when the trap is sprung. Enter the Babylonians.
Right. At this point in history, Babylon is not yet the global, world-dominating superpower it will eventually become under Nebuchadnezzar. They are currently a rising, ambitious but secondary state, actively trying to build diplomatic alliances to throw off the yoke of Assyria.
Okay, that makes sense.
The king of Babylon, a man named Baladan, hears about Hezekiah's miraculous recovery from his illness. He likely also heard about the astronomical anomaly with the sundial, which would have been intensely interesting to Babylonian astronomers.
Oh, for sure.
So he sends a delegation of envoys to Jerusalem, carrying letters and a very expensive present.
On the surface, it is a perfectly polite, congratulatory diplomatic mission, but beneath the surface, it is a scouting expedition. Babylon is taking the measure of Judah, and Hezekiah completely falls for the flattery.
He really does.
He is so relieved by the peace, so puffed up by his recent victories, and so flattered by the attention from this sophisticated rising power in the East. So what does he do? He welcomes them in, and he shows them everything.
Everything. The text leaves no room for ambiguity. It says Hezekiah showed them all his treasure house, the silver, the gold, the spices, the precious oil. He showed them his armory. There was nothing in his house or in all his dominion that he did not show them.
Let me pause and play devil's advocate again, because I can hear the listener wondering, well, why is this such a catastrophic sin? Hezekiah is a king. Babylon is a potential ally against a mutual enemy. Isn't showing off your armory and your treasury just standard geopolitical diplomacy?
Sounds like it, yeah.
You project strength to secure alliances. Why is this framed as a massive failure?
That is exactly how Hezekiah justified it to himself. It looks like pragmatic diplomacy. But Matthew Henry and other commentators drill down into the spiritual and psychological reality beneath the action. Hezekiah's failure was a failure of the heart.
Oh, interesting.
The strength that had saved him from Assyria was his profound vulnerability. Laying the letter out before the Lord, recognizing his own helplessness, and trusting in divine intervention, not his own wealth.
Right. He had literally stripped the gold off his own doors to pay the Assyrians, and it didn't work. His wealth failed him. God saved him.
Exactly. But now, in peacetime, the fear is gone and the ego returns. He doesn't tell the Babylonians about the angel striking the Assyrian camp. He doesn't boast about the mercy of God healing his terminal illness. He boasts about his spices. He boasts about his silver. He wants to prove to the cool, sophisticated Babylonians that he is a player on the world stage. He let his guard down entirely to seek validation from a secular power.
The modern parallel here is painful to think about because it is so common. Imagine a brilliant startup founder. They just went through a brutal market downturn. They almost lost the company. But they pivoted, they leaned on their core team, they survived by the skin of their teeth, and now they are profitable again.
Yeah.
And then a massive, predatory, multinational tech conglomerate invites them to a summit, supposedly just to praise their innovation and explore synergies.
And the founder is so eager for the ego boost, so desperate for validation from the big leagues after years of grinding in the dark, that they invite the conglomerate's executives into their headquarters. And they show them everything.
Everything.
They show them their proprietary code, their algorithms, their unreleased product roadmaps, their internal financial modeling. They open the kimono completely just to prove they belong at the big table.
And the conglomerate takes copious notes, goes back to their headquarters, and uses all that inside information to build a competing product that eventually crushes the startup. How often do we do this in our own lives?
Too often.
After surviving a major trauma or a life challenge, we sabotage our own hard-won peace by seeking the approval of the very people or systems that will eventually exploit us. We forget that the quiet humility that got us through the crisis is the exact same tool we need to survive the success. Hezekiah survived the war, but his ego couldn't survive a compliment.
And the prophet Isaiah, who functions as the moral conscience of the nation, immediately sees the disaster. He comes to the palace and interrogates the king like a prosecuting attorney. Who were those men? Where did they come from? What did they see?
And Hezekiah is clueless.
He is. Hezekiah, still completely blinded by his own pride, answers cheerfully, "Oh, they came from a far country, from Babylon, and I showed them absolutely everything. There isn't a single thing in my treasuries I didn't show them."
He is actually proud of it, and then Isaiah delivers the hammer blow.
Isaiah says, "Hear the word of the Lord. Behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house, and that which your fathers have stored up till this day, shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left. And some of your own sons, who will come from you, whom you will father, shall be taken away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon."
It is a prophecy of total, absolute ruin. Everything he just bragged about will be stolen by the very people he tried to impress. His own flesh and blood will be enslaved and mutilated. It's a direct, devastating consequence of this moment of egotistical vulnerability. But Hezekiah's response to this horrific prophecy is, well, it might be the most uncomfortable verse in the entire book.
Hezekiah looks at Isaiah and says, "The word of the Lord which you have spoken is good." And then he essentially mutters to himself, for he thought, "Is it not so? If there will be peace and truth in my days."
Peace in my days. We really have to unpack this because it reveals a chilling shift in his character.
Some earlier commentators try to be generous here, suggesting Hezekiah is humbly submitting to divine justice and expressing gratitude that God is delaying the punishment. But when you look at the reality of the statement, especially through a modern lens, it exposes a deeply flawed, incredibly selfish, short-term mindset.
Yeah.
Hezekiah is essentially saying, well, the future is going to be an absolute apocalyptic disaster for my children and my grandchildren, but hey, at least the economy will be stable and I won't have to deal with a war before I die.
It is the ultimate expression of the worst kind of generational selfishness. I got mine. The national debt is exploding, the environment is collapsing, the institutions are rotting, but the stock market is up today. So, peace in my days, right? It is a catastrophic failure of long-term vision and parental responsibility. He prioritized his present comfort over the future survival of his people.
And it poses a profound, penetrating question for us today. Look at the decisions you are making right now, in your business, in your environmental footprint, in the way you raise your children, and the financial debts you are accumulating. Are you making choices that secure your own immediate temporary comfort at the devastating long-term expense of the people who will inherit the world after you're gone?
Wow.
True wisdom is planting trees under whose shade you do not expect to sit. Hezekiah stopped planting trees and just started consuming the shade.
And the tragedy of that short-sightedness is that the bill comes due almost immediately. Which brings us to the profound darkness of the next generation. Hezekiah's 15 bonus years eventually run out, he dies, and his son Manasseh takes the throne. And because Hezekiah coasted to the finish line, Manasseh inherits a kingdom that is materially wealthy but spiritually hollow. And Manasseh plunges the nation into a 55-year dark age.
Manasseh's reign is described in the text as the absolute nadir, the lowest possible point of Judah's history. He is 12 years old when he begins to reign, and he reigns for 55 years, over half a century of systemic, accelerating corruption. He doesn't just quietly undo Hezekiah's reforms, he aggressively engineers a society-wide plunge into depravity.
How does a society get there so fast? How do you go from Hezekiah spreading the letter before the Lord to what Manasseh does?
It happens through gradual, relentless desensitization. Manasseh rebuilds the idolatrous high places. He erects altars for Baal. But he goes further than previous kings. He introduces deep occultic practices into the mainstream culture. He brings in astrology, what commentators call Sabaeism, the worship of the host of heaven. And he doesn't just do this in the countryside. He builds altars for the stars in the 2 courtyards of the temple of the Lord. He brings the toxic tools right into the most sacred spaces of their identity.
He desecrates the sanctuary, and it gets so much darker.
It does. He practices sorcery, divination, and necromancy. He consults with mediums and spiritists, and then he crosses the ultimate horrifying moral boundary. He reinstates the worship of Moloch in the valley of the son of Hinnom at a place called Topheth.
Unbelievable.
This involved literal, ritualistic child sacrifice. He makes his own son pass through the fire. The text also explicitly notes that Manasseh shed very much innocent blood until he had filled Jerusalem from one end to another. It is a reign of absolute terror, political assassination, and systemic violence.
He completely obliterates the moral compass of an entire civilization. And this isn't a brief blip. This lasts for over 5 decades. Think about that. Whole generations of people are born, grow old, and die knowing nothing but this darkness.
They don't know any better.
Right. They don't remember Hezekiah's Passover. They only know the fires of Topheth. Manasseh is eventually succeeded by his son Amon, who is just as wicked, but Amon's own servants assassinate him after just 2 years. The society is eating itself alive.
And out of this bloody, chaotic, trauma-soaked environment, an 8-year-old boy named Josiah is put on the throne. Josiah inherits a kingdom that is financially drained, politically weak, and morally bankrupt.
But Josiah's is different. The text tells us that he seeks a different path. When he is 26 years old, in the 18th year of his reign, he decides to initiate repairs on the temple. It has been neglected and abused for decades. He sends his secretary, Shaphan, to organize the funding and the labor. And during these routine renovations, while clearing out the rubble and the accumulated debris of half a century of neglect, the high priest, Hezekiah, makes a discovery that changes the course of their history.
Hezekiah comes to the secretary and says, "I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord."
We have to stop and grasp the magnitude of this. They literally found the foundational document of their entire civilization hidden under the floorboards. It had been completely lost.
Barnes and other historians note that this was likely the original copy of the Torah, perhaps the very scroll deposited by Moses or Joshua, which had been hidden away by faithful priests during the violent purges of Manasseh to save it from destruction. The fact that it was lost shows how far they had fallen.
Yeah.
The society had become so deeply corrupted, so far removed from its origins, that the current generation didn't even know their own constitution, their own covenant existed anymore.
Imagine the profound disorientation of that moment. Think about what happens when an individual, a family, or a massive organization suddenly realizes they have completely lost their way. When the original mission statement, the core moral compass that founded the institution, is literally dug out of a filing cabinet and you read it out loud. And the contrast between who we promised to be and who we actually are right now is agonizingly clear.
It is the shock of seeing your true reflection after decades of living in a funhouse mirror. It's like finding the original blueprints of a beautiful structural home you bought and realizing that over the years, the previous owners removed all the load-bearing walls, let the foundation crack, and essentially built a toxic waste dump in the living room. The structural integrity is gone.
So Shaphan the secretary takes this ancient scroll back to King Josiah, and he reads it out loud. And Josiah's reaction to hearing the actual words of the covenant is the masterclass blueprint for how we should handle those agonizing, humbling moments of realization.
When Josiah hears the words of the law, he doesn't make excuses. He doesn't call a PR firm to spin the narrative. He doesn't blame his grandfather Manasseh, even though it was absolutely Manasseh's fault that the nation was in this state. He doesn't downplay the severity of the crisis. The text says he tore his clothes. It is an expression of profound visceral grief and horror at the reality of their communal sin.
The biblical text says he had a tender heart. He humbles himself. He immediately convenes his top officials and sends a delegation to a prophetess named Huldah. He says, "Go inquire of the Lord for me and for the people. For great is the wrath of the Lord that is kindled against us, because our fathers have not obeyed the words of this book." He takes full, immediate ownership of a crisis he did not start.
This is a crucial reflection for the listener. When you are confronted with a hard, undeniable truth about your own behavior, maybe a blind spot you've ignored for years, or when you realize you are participating in a deeply toxic workplace culture, how do you react? Do you get defensive? Do you immediately point fingers at previous management or your ex or your parents?
Most people do.
Or do you have a tender heart? Can you accept the painful, unvarnished truth without deflecting blame? Josiah absorbs the blow, and he seeks truth, even if it hurts.
And the message he gets back from Huldah the prophetess is a very difficult, mixed message. She confirms his worst fear. She says, the kingdom is doomed. The damage done by Manasseh is too deep, the systems are too broken, the idolatry is too entrenched, the destruction is absolutely coming.
But there's a caveat.
Right, she adds a personal caveat. Because Josiah had a tender heart, because he wept and humbled himself when he heard the truth, God says, I will gather you to your fathers, and you shall be gathered to your grave in peace, and your eyes shall not see all the disaster that I will bring upon this place.
Now think back to Hezekiah. A lesser leader, hearing that the destruction was delayed until after his death, might have reacted exactly like his great-grandfather. Great, peace in my days, the ship is sinking, but it won't sink until I'm gone, so I'll just ride it out in comfort.
Exactly.
But Josiah does the exact opposite. Even knowing that the ultimate doom of the nation is sealed, he launches into a ferocious, uncompromising, total cleansing of the land.
It is extreme. He doesn't just do a little light remodeling. He gathers all the elders, the priests, and the common people at the temple, and he personally reads the entire book of the covenant to them. He stands by the pillar and makes a solemn covenant to walk after the Lord. And then he goes to absolute war against the corruption.
He orders the priests to drag all the vessels made for Baal and the Asherah out of the temple, and he burns them outside Jerusalem in the fields of the Kidron. He deposes the idolatrous priests. He breaks down the houses of the male cult prostitutes that were right there in the house of the Lord. He defiles the high places from Jeba to Beersheba.
He specifically targets Topheth, that horrific site in the valley of Hinnom where the child sacrifices took place. The text says he defiled it. He turned it into a garbage dump and a graveyard, making it ceremonially and physically impossible for it ever to be used for those atrocities again. He crushes the altars Manasseh built, grinds them to dust, and throws the dust into the brook.
He even goes up north to Bethel, to the ancient altar set up by Jeroboam centuries earlier, and he burns it down. He digs up the bones of the corrupt false priests who had led the people into this multi-generational darkness, and he burns their bones on their own altars, completely desecrating the sites of false worship.
Okay, we really need to pause here and exercise some deep discernment, because for a modern listener sitting in their car or going for a run, hearing about a leader digging up graves, burning human bones, and violently destroying religious sites, it is incredibly jarring. It sounds like religious extremism. How do we extract wisdom from this without endorsing ancient theocratic violence?
It's a vital question. This is a major obstacle for modern readers. We have to be absolutely clear, we do not endorse and we cannot attempt to apply the physical theocratic violence of the ancient world to our modern pluralistic context. The execution of religious opponents and the physical destruction of their shrines belongs to an ancient covenantal paradigm that we have rightly moved past.
So what is the takeaway? Just that Josiah was really intense?
No, we have to look beneath the ancient methods to find the enduring wisdom. The core translatable principle here is the absolute uncompromising refusal to tolerate internal toxic systems.
It's the chemotherapy analogy.
Exactly. If you go to an oncologist and find out you have stage 4 cancer, which is essentially what Manasseh's legacy was to the societal body of Judah, you don't just take an aspirin, you don't put a Band-Aid on a tumor. You have to deploy a systemic, radical, highly aggressive treatment that touches every single part of the body. The treatment itself is painful, it feels destructive, it makes you sick.
Yeah.
But you are trying to kill the cancer before the cancer kills a host.
In your own life, you obviously don't execute your coworkers or burn down your neighbor's house, but you must aggressively and completely burn down the internal habits, the hidden addictions, the deep-seated ethical compromises, or the toxic relationships that are destroying your life. You cannot negotiate with Topheth. You cannot find a middle ground with a habit that is demanding the sacrifice of your future or your integrity or your family's well-being. You have to grind it to dust. You have to defile it so you can never go back to it. Josiah's zeal is a powerful metaphor for the radical, non-negotiable boundaries we must sometimes set to save our own souls.
And Josiah finishes this massive, exhausting purge by calling the nation together to celebrate the Passover. And the text notes that no such Passover had been kept since the days of the judges who judged Israel. It was a massive, brilliant, wholehearted return to their roots.
It was magnificent. It was the greatest reform in their history. But tragically, it wasn't enough, which brings us to the final heartbreaking reality of our deep dive, the inevitable fall and the surprising endurance of hope.
Despite all of Josiah's passion, his life ends abruptly. In the 31st year of his reign, he goes out to battle against Pharaoh Necho of Egypt at the plain of Megiddo. It's a geopolitical miscalculation, and Josiah is killed in battle. He's only 39 years old. His servants bring his body back to Jerusalem in a chariot, and the entire nation mourns him.
It's a devastating, disorienting blow, and the text makes a very sobering, difficult point right here. Despite Josiah's incredible goodness, the underlying rot of the nation was just too deep. The text says, "Still the Lord did not turn from the burning of his great wrath, because of all the provocations with which Manasseh had provoked him. The kingdom's fate is sealed."
It is heavy.
I have to admit, representing the listener here, I find this incredibly discouraging. Josiah does everything right. He humbles himself, he grinds the idols to dust, he reinstates the Passover, he fights the good fight. But God still destroys the nation. What is the point of doing the right thing? What is the point of radical reform if systemic collapse is inevitable anyway?
It is a deeply uncomfortable reality, especially for modern audiences who are heavily steeped in individualism. We love the Hollywood narrative that one great leader, one heroic effort can fix any problem and save the day. But the ancient text is confronting us with the terrifying, realistic weight of systemic consequences. Sometimes the inertia of past communal sins, like the decades of innocent bloodshed under Manasseh, creates a historical inevitability.
Yeah.
The institutional decay is so profound, the cultural rot is so deep, that a single good leader, no matter how sincere, simply cannot avert the structural collapse.
Matthew Henry has an incredibly sharp, penetrating insight into why Josiah's reforms didn't stick. He notes that the people of Judah submitted to Josiah's power, but they didn't adopt his principles.
That is the absolute crux of the tragedy. Josiah's reforms are ultimately enforced from the top down. He commanded the idols to be destroyed, and the people obeyed because he had the authority of the crown. But the hearts of the masses hadn't actually changed. They were still harboring the same toxic desires for the false gods. They were just hiding them while the good king was alive.
That makes a lot of sense.
You can force compliance in a corporation. You can pass strict laws in a nation. You can even force yourself into a rigid, disciplined, new daily routine. But if the underlying culture, if the heart doesn't genuinely transform, disaster is only delayed, it is not prevented. Behavior modification without heart transformation always ends in collapse.
And the disaster comes remarkably fast. Following Josiah's death, his successors, his sons Jehoahaz and Jehoiakim, his grandson Jehoiachin, and finally his other son Zedekiah, are weak, compromised, and utterly ineffective. They revert back to the evil practices. And they are treated as little more than pawns in a massive geopolitical chess match between the declining power of Egypt and the new, unstoppable, terrifying superpower, the Babylonian Empire under King Nebuchadnezzar.
Remember Isaiah's prophecy to Hezekiah all those years ago about the treasures being carried off to Babylon? The bill has come due. Nebuchadnezzar marches on Jerusalem.
The final chapters of 2 Kings are a grim, methodical accounting of the end of the world. Nebuchadnezzar lays siege to Jerusalem. It is horrific. The city is starved into submission over months and months. The text simply notes, the famine was so severe in the city that there was no food for the people of the land.
The walls are finally breached. The Babylonian army pours in. The last king of Judah, Zedekiah, tries to flee by night with his soldiers, slipping through a gate between 2 walls. But the Chaldean army pursues him and captures him in the plains of Jericho. And Zedekiah's fate is uniquely, psychologically cruel.
They bring him before Nebuchadnezzar at Riblah. The Babylonians execute Zedekiah's own sons right in front of him. And then immediately after he watches his children die, they gouge out Zedekiah's eyes so that the brutal murder of his family is the very last thing he will ever see for the rest of his life. They bind him in bronze chains and take him away to Babylon in darkness.
The dismantling of the society is total. Nebuzaradan, the captain of the Babylonian bodyguard, burns the house of the Lord. The majestic, magnificent temple built by Solomon centuries earlier, the center of their universe, is reduced to ash. He burns the king's house and all the houses of Jerusalem. The Babylonian army breaks down the walls around the city.
They systematically destroy the infrastructure. They take the massive bronze pillars from the temple and break them into pieces to carry the metal away. They take the gold, the silver, the fire pans, the bowls, and then they deport the population. The elite, the skilled workers, the politicians, the priests, they were all taken into exile in Babylon. The text says that the captain of the guard left only some of the poorest of the land to be vine dressers and plowmen.
It is the absolute worst-case scenario. The systemic collapse is complete. The covenant seems broken. The land is desolate. The consequences of generations of compromise, arrogance, short-sightedness, and cruelty have finally fully come to fruition. It is a very dark, very heavy place to end the historical narrative of the kings.
But it doesn't actually end there. Not quite.
No, it doesn't. And this is where the text offers a profound, almost subversive glimmer of hope. tucked away in the very last verses of the book. The narrative jumps forward. We are decades into the Babylonian captivity. The people are exiles. They have lost their homes, their temple, their freedom, and largely their identity. But the historian focuses our attention on one specific man, Jehoiachin.
Jehoiachin was the king of Judah right before Zedekiah. He was Josiah's grandson. He had surrendered to Nebuchadnezzar during an earlier siege, and he had been rotting in a Babylonian prison for 37 years.
37 years in a dungeon in a foreign land. He's a forgotten relic of a destroyed kingdom. But then King Nebuchadnezzar dies, and a new Babylonian king comes to the throne, a man named Evil Merodach. And for reasons the text doesn't fully explain, in the year he begins to reign, Evil Merodach decides to show an act of unprompted mercy.
The text says he graciously freed Jehoiachin, king of Judah, from prison. He spoke kindly to him. He gave him a seat of honor higher than the seats of the other captive kings who were with him in Babylon. He took off Jehoiachin's prison garments, and every day of his life he dined regularly at the king's table.
It's such a specific, quiet, intimate detail to end on. Why conclude this massive, bloody, epic history of empires rising and falling with one old man getting out of jail and eating dinner at a king's table?
Because it is a theological and psychological lifeline. It is telling the reader, and it is telling us today, even when the absolute worst-case scenario happens, even when the city falls, when the company goes bankrupt, when the marriage officially ends, when the diagnosis is terminal, when you are sitting in the ashes of the life you thought you were going to have, it is not the end of the story.
In the absolute midnight of captivity, there is still the possibility of grace. The line of David, the promise of the covenant, is not entirely dead. It is battered, it is in exile, but it is still breathing.
Think about what this means for you right now if you are in a season of exile. How do you maintain hope and dignity when you are sitting in the rubble of your own plans? You look for the small, unexpected moments of grace. You put on the new clothes. You accept the kindness. You take the seat at the table. You recognize that while the old structures have completely burned down, the story is still being written.
That is the ultimate form of resilience, acknowledging the profound reality of the ruin, weeping over the losses without letting it extinguish the possibility of future restoration. It is the quiet endurance of hope.
Which brings us full circle, back to the very beginning of our deep dive. We started by talking about King Hezekiah and the Nehushtan, that ancient bronze serpent that Moses made. It was a tool of miraculous healing. It literally saved their ancestors from death in the wilderness. But over time, it became a crutch, it became an idol, it became a dusty piece of brass that was actively keeping them from engaging with the present reality of their relationship with God. Hezekiah had to have the courage to smash it into powder so the nation could move forward.
And that is the final provocative thought we want to leave you to explore on your own today. As you navigate your own external crises, your own internal successes, and your own necessary seasons of reform, you have to ask yourself a very hard question. What is your Nehushtan?
What is a habit, a success metric, a relationship dynamic, or a deeply held tradition in your life that originally brought you healing or growth, but has now become an idol that is holding you back? Maybe it is a defensive emotional mechanism you built during a childhood trauma that kept you safe then, but is actively destroying your marriage right now. Maybe it is a relentless work ethic and a business strategy that made you your first $1 million, but is now blinding you to a changing market and ruining your health. Maybe it is a religious or political tradition that once gave you a sense of belonging and comfort, but has now become a tribalistic tool you use to judge and alienate others.
Sometimes, the hardest part of growth isn't fighting the terrifying Assyrian army outside the walls. The hardest part is having the courage to walk into your own internal sacred spaces, look at the things you have loved and relied on for years, and realize they are poisoning you. Sometimes, to survive the present and secure the future, we have to be willing to break the very things that saved us in the past.
That's the heart of this section. This is wisdom for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.